How sweet are thy words unto my taste, yea, sweeter than honey to my mouth. Through thy precepts I get understanding, therefore I hate every false way. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet, and a light unto my path.
Because all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of the grass. The grass withers, and the flower falls away, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Now this is the word which by the gospel was preached to you.
Jesus Christ engaged in a very interesting conversation with a Samaritan woman at the well of Jacob. We read about this in John chapter 4. The Lord is interested in catapulting her to a higher spiritual plane, number one, catapulting her to a higher moral plane, number two, and catapulting her to a higher ecclesiastical plane, number three. That's where we want to camp out as we continue our series on worship on the Biblical Christianity podcast. Thank you for joining us today. So glad that you are able to be with us. My name is Terrence Brownlow Dindy. I'm the director of the Texas School of Preaching. Got beside me Brother Mornay Stephanus, one of our instructors at the Texas School of Preaching, and then Brother Tom Moore, also our Dean of Students and an instructor at the Texas School of Preaching. And so we began taking a look at the idea of worship on last week, and this week we want to continue in the same vein of thought. We want to look at a discussion that we call worship details. So last week we answered the question, why worship? Why do we worship God? Because God demands it, because he deserves it, and because he desires it. That's what we see unfolded for us in the pages of Holy Writ. But this week, again, we want to look at the idea of worship details. Now that we know why we worship, what are the details of worship? And I think that the book of John chapter 4 is a beautiful passage to be able to catapult us into this particular discussion because of Christ's encounter with this woman at the well. Whenever Christ wants to change the subject to her moral situation, obviously she becomes very uncomfortable there. Christ says to her, hey, go get your husband. See, first of all, he's trying to help her to focus on spiritual water rather than physical water, which she is enamored with. She won't rise to the plane that he's trying to catapult her to, and so he changes the subject to her morality. Go get your husband. Well, her response is, I don't have a husband. Don't have a husband. He says, yeah, you've had 5. And the guy that you're shacked up with now is not your husband. Well, that becomes a very uncomfortable conversation for her. So she changes the subject to worship. So I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worship here in this mountain. They're in Samaria. She's talking about Mount Gerizim. Your fathers worshipped in Jerusalem. Which is it? And of course, Christ's response is this: believe me, the hour cometh when you shall neither worship in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem. Worship the Father. You worship what you know not. We worship what we do know, for salvation is of the Jews. No doubt a reference back to the book of 2 Kings chapter 17 and the formulation of the Samaritan ethnicity, if you will, yes, and the fact that there's a hybrid worship. Those Gentiles that have been imported by these Assyrian kings, well, they bring their false worship practices with them. There's a priest that comes back and tries to teach them the worship practices of God. They formulate a hybrid of the two, unfortunately, rather than just worshiping God faithfully, and that becomes their worship practices. That's what's under consideration here. Mm-hmm. And so with that, Christ says, but the hour cometh, and now is, when true worshipers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth, for the Father seeketh such to worship him. Now, let's let chapter 4, verse number 24, formulate the framework for what we're about to talk about.
You know, when you look at that verse, John 4 and verse 24, there are, it's the classic text on Christian worship.
Yes.
And an analysis of this text reveals the absolute of Christian worship, must. There is the action of Christian worship, worship. There is the aim of Christian worship, him. There is the attitude of Christian worship, spirit, and then the authority of Christian worship, truth.
Yes, sir.
You know, and I just might mention here for a second, we're talking about worship. You know, the word worship is found 119 times in the New Testament or in the Bible. And if God discusses a topic one time, it's important. But when it's mentioned 119 times, that tells us how important this topic is that we are discussing. And so when we think about this idea of Christian worship, the absolute of Christian worship must. Jesus says, God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship in spirit and truth. Now, the word must is a modifier. You think about how that word must is used other places. We must have faith. Hebrews 11, verse 6. They must believe that he is, right? Mark 16, verse 16. You must be baptized. And we must worship him. And so must shows that there's an important part of worship here.
That's right. There's an oughtness, an obligation.
Yeah, absolutely. When sometimes we take for granted simple meanings like that and simple understanding of words and of must. We can sit around, we can talk about it. Well, everybody understands that, but not everyone understands that, the must aspect. If you take your minds back to Luke chapter 20, specifically verses 1 through 8, as Jesus, it happened in those days, it says he taught the people in the temple, Jesus, and he preached the gospel, that the chief priests and the scribes, they came together with the elders and confronted him and spoke to him, saying, "Tell us," notice this, "by what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" The chief priests, the scribes, and the Pharisees, as corrupt as they were, even they understood that there had to be authority. There was the authority connected to what Jesus was doing. There had to be authority. You had to be given authority to do this, right? And so when we get to the word must, when we say you must do this, obviously if there is a must, there must of necessity be authority connected to it, right? And so what we're looking at obviously is the concept that if we must do it, then there is a command for us to do it. And the quintessential passage, as Tom mentioned, John chapter 4 and verse 24 here, where it says, the Father desires this. He seeks us to worship him, and we must worship him in spirit and in truth. There cannot be any question. We must worship.
Yes, it's not an optional matter. Sometimes when you talk to Christians that have not maybe reached a level of maturity that they ought to have reached it, they're still wrestling in their mind as to whether or not it's an obligation for me to be here on Sundays. Can I just be a Christian to myself? It's larger than part of the denominational idea, this idea of embracing Christ as your own personal Savior. And we've seen and talked to people who they understand that idea is that I don't have to be a part of any corporate worship. I don't have to be any part of any institutionalized religion. I can do this on my own. But no, the Bible teaches us that when it comes to worship and corporate worship at that, this thing is not an option. So it's not a must for us.
It's been said that must is heaven's imperative. It is the master's mandate. There's no choice in us breathing. We must breathe if we want to live. And there is no choice in worshiping. If we want to live spiritually, we must worship him. And you think about this word must, it modifies three elements which constitute Christian worship that we're going to be looking at today and maybe a couple of them in our next episode. But must modifies the object of worship, him. It must be him. Secondly, it modifies the attitude. It must be in spirit. And thirdly, it modifies the standard of worship. It must be in truth. And so sometimes we kind of overlook those words we don't deem as significant, but must is a very significant term in our text as we're looking at today.
That's it. What do we got next, Brother Tom?
Well, the next thing is the action of Christian worship. And in this, I think we need to talk about worship itself. What does it really mean? Of course, you're our local Greek scholar. Give us some insight into the Greek words, especially proskuneo and latruo, in regard to our worship.
Yeah, so there's definitely several words in the New Testament that are translated worship. We think about the most frequently translated word is proskuneo. We look at the word lutreo is also used fairly frequently. Sebomai is a word that you see that is translated worship. Therapeuo is a word that's also translated worship. And so there are multiplicity of words, and these words, kind of like the words for the elder in the church, kind of the words embody, if you will, different aspects of the worship action. And so, just like when we're talking about the eldership, just to give you a quick example, of course, we're called shepherds, and that is the idea of feeding the flock. We're called bishops. That's the idea of overseeing the flock. We're called elders. That has to do with the idea that this is not to be a novice, but an older man. And so the words that are utilized are words that help you to understand the nature of the office. Same thing with worship. When you look at proskuneo, again, this is going to be a word that literally means in the Greek language to kiss toward. To kiss toward. So when you think about that, of course, we understand that this is a metaphorical term that talks about the disposition of worship, the attitude or our demeanor toward the one that it becomes our object of worship. The kiss toward, that this is a gesture. Again, it's used metaphorically, but a gesture of veneration, a gesture of homage, of respect, of reverence. And so we see that. And then, of course, Brother Mornay, matter of fact, at school earlier today, you were talking about the idea of latreuo and how that this is more of the idea of the physical action of worship. So go ahead with that.
Yeah, when we consider the word latreuo as defined as to serve in a religious sense. To serve, as we talked about earlier today, you have proskuneo and you have sebomai, which really is a disposition of mind. It's a mindset that is bowing towards, that has reverence to the Most High. And where latreuo takes more of a to render religious homage in action, to do certain things in religious services, and as they come before God and they're bringing an offering, they're serving in that sense, but which is a part of worship. So it's obviously, we want to make this clarification: all worship is service, but not all service is worship. There's certainly false doctrines out there where people say that brushing your teeth is worship. Right. No, that's not the case at all. Worship is a specific act. It is a presentation of ourselves to the one who is being worshipped. And so when we consider this word, I like the word sebomai, and maybe Brother Tom can go into a little bit of detail about sebomai, because I think that really it encapsulates the mental attitude, if you will.
Yeah. When I think about that word and proskuneo and latreuo, sebomai, proskuneo, it's of an attitude, disposition. Latreuo, service, like you mentioned. And isn't that interesting how that when God wants to be worshiped, he wants to be worshiped in spirit, attitude, and truth. So you have proskuneo some 60 times. It's used in the New Testament. Sebomai 10 times. We might define it as to stand in awe, to venerate, to reverence, to worship, to adore. Latreuo used 21 times. And so again, we get the picture here of our worship, one of great reverence and respect, but also actual action behind the worship.
I mean, that's it. We know that we have delineated for us. I say delineated. We have at least revealed for us. They're not actually just in a line list, but that we have revealed to us in the scriptures, the New Testament, 5 acts of New Testament worship. And so when it comes to our worship, again, it's not a free-for-all. We don't simply do what it is that we think God desires. We don't do what we feel like he might accept. We actually listen to what God teaches us, and we follow those directives. And so he tells us what things comprise New Testament worship. He tells us that singing to him, Ephesians chapter 5, verse number 19, speaking to yourselves in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody in your hearts unto the Lord. There's your action. Singing and making melody in your hearts unto the Lord. Praying, so many different places. I think about Philippians 4, verse number 6, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication. Make your requests known unto God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds through Jesus Christ. Hebrews 4, verse number 16, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in our times of need. And we can go on, but prayer is an act of worship that God expects.
I think about this idea of those 3 Greek words, and these word studies, it's clear that true worship entails participation, right?
That's right.
We must be participants, not spectators. And secondly, in true worship, we are not the audience. God is the audience. We are worshiping. So our aim then should be to please Him. We must worship. We must participate in giving praise to God. You know, I've heard people say something like, I just don't really get anything out of worship. My response is, well, that's because you've not put anything into worship.
Yep.
When they say, I don't get anything out of worship, that shows to me they have a false concept of what worship is.
Yeah, so that's what we're talking about here. So we've talked about the absolute of worship. We've talked about the action of worship very briefly, and we'll come back to that a little bit later on, maybe in the next episode. But now talking about the aim of worship. Who is the aim? Who's the audience of worship? And again, Brother Tom, I believe that's born of a misconception of what worship is. Whenever somebody comes out of worship says, well, I didn't get anything out of that. There's been times where I've invited my denominational friends to come worship, and I ask, well, what is your evaluation? Well, I didn't really get anything out of that. Well, that's a false concept of who is the audience of worship. Yeah. See, it wasn't for you, although inherently we get a benefit from worship as worshipers. It's not for us, and we're not the audience.
Yeah,
we're not the aim of worship. It's God.
You know, it's amazing to me that this is the mindset of, in the modern day, this is the mindset where it was never the mindset of anyone worshiping, whether it was a false god or whether it was Jehovah God. Mm-hmm. Everyone understood that worship was directional. It was towards a certain individual, right? It was towards a certain individual. It was towards the false god, towards the statue or whatever. They didn't walk away from idolatry. Well, I didn't get anything out of that. Why? Because inherently in the concept of worship is the idea of presentation. You are presenting to someone. Something's not being presented to you. You are the one presenting. And so it is true of false worship. It is true of authentic worship, with obviously one major distinction, the reason behind the offering. But idolaters offer sacrifices to their idols to appease the wrath of their gods or to gain the favor of their gods. Our sacrifice to God springs from a different motivation, obviously. His preeminence, as we talked about already. It's right to worship God, His provision. He deserves for us to worship Him. And so when you consider this, if we can get maybe the mindset or maybe a better definition, understanding about worship, that it is given towards God. Why? Because that's what worship is. It cannot be anything else. If you are desirous to get something out of worship in terms of it's for you, then you're missing the point. Essentially, you're asking for people to worship you.
That's what I was about to say. You become the object of worship. If it's about what I want, what seems right to me, what feels good to me, what my desires are, then have you not effectively become the object of worship rather than God?
Exactly right. And we think about way back in Israel's history in Exodus chapter 20, where Moses was giving the 10 Commandments. How did he begin those 10 Commandments? Is by worshiping God, not idols, not self, not your own desires, but worshiping God. It was true from the very beginning of time. God always demanded Him, deity, Jehovah God, to be worshiped. And when we realize that in our worship, it's for Him and not for us that we've been talking about here, then we start realizing the true essence of worship is what we're giving. Now, let's be honest. When we worship God correctly, we receive benefit.
That's it. And so that's what we mentioned a moment ago. That's right. There's going to be an inherent benefit to the worshiper if this thing is being done correctly. The Bible tells us as much. But again, we cannot negate the fact that God is the object. Had a dear friend of our family years ago. I grew up with the kids of this family, and their parents were peers to my parents. And the mother died. She passed away, I guess it's been about 2 or 3 years ago at this point. She had defected from the Lord's church, her and her husband and her whole family actually, years ago. And there'd be times where my mother and father and other members of the church would try to encourage her to come back. And she had become very steeped in denominationalism, and my mom would tell me that her response would be on multiple occasions, I don't know, I can't go back to the Church of Christ. I just love worshiping with my instruments and listening to the band and singing with the band and these types of things in this denomination she was a part of. If you'd ever gone to her and said, Her name is Carol. Miss Carol, do you worship yourself? Are you your own God? Man, she would have denied that vehemently. But whenever the answer and the response is, why don't you come back to the Lord's church? No, I just got to be able to worship with my instruments, and I got to be able to be involved in my praise teams and things like that. You set yourself up as God. I want to read a quote to you guys real quickly. And this is widespread and rampant in our society, and it's even spilled into the church, is the point that I'm making. But this is by a theologian by the name of Leslie Newbigin. Anytime we quote some of these guys who are not members of the church, we give a disclaimer with no uncertain terms. These people are not saved. If they've not obeyed the gospel, they will not go to heaven if they do not repent. We don't extol these people, fall in love with denominational scholarship. I'm simply saying this man, who's a denominationalist, he's in trouble if he doesn't repent, but he wrote something I thought was worthwhile, and I wrote it down. He says, the secular societies that have developed in Europe since the 17th century share a common belief that reliable knowledge about human nature, and therefore about how human life is to be managed, is to be found not by reliance upon divine revelation and grace, but by reliance upon the methods of empirical science. This, broadly speaking, is the dogma that controls public life, as distinct from private opinions that individuals are free to hold. But the dogma does not measure up to the realities of human nature. If there is no answer to the question, but why did this happen to me? People will turn to astrology. If there is no answer to the question, what is human life really for? What is the purpose of human life and the whole creation? People will seek to fill the void with the search for instant pleasure in drugs, sex, and mindless violence through which one can express a sense of meaninglessness. We have to be endlessly entertained, and we have to have idols to fill the empty space from which the living God has been removed. In the end, the society that we have is not a secular society, but a pagan society, a society in which men and women are giving their allegiance to no gods. Man, what a great statement and observation. He's talking about in Europe because he's from England, but that applies to America as well. We have taken God out of the way. And I think one of you guys mentioned on the last podcast that we as human beings are inherently religious. We're incurably religious. God has made us that way. And so if we remove God as the object of worship, better believe we're going to put something in its place.
Exactly right. You know, you think about the idea of our object of worship. Even Jesus said in Matthew chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, it says, and he said, all these will I give thee if thou shalt fall down and worship me. That's what Satan was saying unto Jesus in a temptation. But then Jesus said to him, get thee from hence, Satan, for it is written, thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou worship.
There you have it.
And so we've got, again, people worship all kinds of things in the world, but many are failing to worship the one true Jehovah God. And if you're not worshiping the one true Jehovah God in the way he wants to be worshiped, then you're involved in will worship, or you're involved in other kinds of worship that's not worshiping the one true God.
Yeah, well, nobody batted an eye in Athens to the multifarious gods that were spread over Athens. Nobody batted an eye. Everybody just assumed and understood within their own reasonings that was okay to do. It took the Apostle Paul to come and say, no, this is not okay.
That's right.
It's not okay for you to have multiple gods. Let me tell you about the unknown God whom you ignorantly worship. Let me explain him to you. Why? Because he is the one whom you are supposed to worship, and he gives the credentials of God, and he says, these are the reasons why you are supposed to worship him. And so, in an idolatrous world, you may be allowed to worship more than one deity. In Hinduism and other idolatrous religions, you can worship more than one deity, quote unquote, false god. But in worship to Jehovah God, he demands complete devotion to him and nothing else. There must be a mindset. Exodus chapter 20, verses 1 through 6, as Tom has already alluded to here, is the Lord clearly says, you will have no other God before me. That has not changed. That is a moral principle that stretches all the way from the very beginning, all the way till when this world burns up, and even yea beyond into eternity.
That's exactly right. So let's jump into, with the time that we have left, let's get into the attitude of worship. Because again, going back to our framework of John chapter 4, verse number 4, Jesus Christ would remind this Samaritan woman at the well of Jacob that God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him, number one, in spirit, number two, in truth. And so that will formulate the last 2 points of our discussion. God must be worshiped. Our worship must be in spirit, according to the correct attitude, and then also in truth, according to the correct authority. So let's deal with the attitude, Brother Tom.
The New Testament worship is spiritual. We are to offer up spiritual sacrifices. 1 Peter 2 and verse 5. We are to draw nigh unto God with a true heart and full assurance of faith. Hebrews 10 and verse 22. And our worship is to be rendered with grace in our hearts unto the Lord. Colossians chapter 3 and verse 17. The Bible talks about singing and making melody in your heart to the Lord.
Yes, sir.
Ephesians 5 verse 19. Colossians 3:16, singing with grace in your heart to the Lord. Colossians 3:16. And Hebrews 12 verse 28. We are to worship God acceptably with reverence and godly fear. Worshiping God according to spirit and the right attitude is just all over the New Testament.
It is, man. When you look at every act of worship that is set forth for us, we looked at two just a moment ago, our singing and our praying, but also included there is our giving, our engaging in the preaching, and the observation of the Lord's Supper. And every one of those acts, you went through a bunch of them in that beautiful montage that you just gave. But even the other ones too that you didn't mention explicitly, we'll mention right here, 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 through 8. But this I say, he which soweth sparingly shall reap also sparingly. He which soweth bountifully shall reap also bountifully. Listen to this. Every man according as he is purposed in his heart, so let him give, not grudgingly or of necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. That is speaking directly to our attitudes whenever we give. Directly to our attitude.
Yeah, when you consider the spiritual nature of worship, as Jesus talked about, as we go back to the main text in John chapter 4, when we consider the spiritual attitude that we're supposed to have, worship, New Testament worship is spiritual in more ways than just one. It's not confined to a place. It's not confined to, like the woman at the well said, in this mountain, and you say here in Jerusalem, and the Lord said, no, that'll all change. And this is not to say that you ought not to gather together with the saints on the first day of the week. That's not what we're talking about. We are supposed to do that, but the location is irrelevant. We can gather in Africa, we can gather anywhere where we can. And so it's not confined to a place, and also it's not confined just to practice. That's the problem that the Jews had. They wanted to worship God. They worshiped God, but only in practice. They made the offering, but they never considered or connected the motivation behind it. But as Tom mentioned here, it is connected to the person. Spiritual worship demands a spiritual person. Spiritual being opposite of carnal. And so you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 3 and verse 3, and the Apostle Paul talks about the carnal mind of the brethren in there, and he rebukes them. He says there's envy, there's strife, there's division. You're carnal and behaving like mere men. And so, you cannot live a worldly life during the week and on Sundays come to worship spiritually. It doesn't work that way.
No.
Spiritual worship requires a spiritual person.
And I think we're going to see here the close connection that we have with worshiping God in spirit and in truth. You look at Matthew chapter 15, beginning in verse 7, he says, you hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people honoreth me with their lips, but their heart is far from me, but in vain do they worship me, teaching as their doctrine the precepts of men. So they were worshiping God incorrectly, and it revolved around the point that their heart was far from them.
Yes, sir. Brother Tom and Brother Mornay, not only those passages, but Malachi tells you the same thing. There's an inseparable link between our attitudes towards worship and what we do. You hear people say things like this all the time whenever they're worshiping in ways that are not authorized by God. Well, God's only concerned with my heart. Doesn't really matter what I'm doing. He's concerned with my heart. Let's just think about that for a moment. From the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks, Matthew chapter 12. Guard your heart with all diligence, for out of it flows the issues of life, Proverbs chapter 4, verse number 23. what we do is like you said, a reflection of the way we feel about a thing. You go over to the book of Malachi chapter 1, and this is a quintessential passage on this subject matter. These people are not worshiping God with the correct items. They're giving things that are lame, blind, stolen, maimed. And what is that a reflection of? Their attitudes toward worship. Look at the attitude toward worship. The Bible says, a son honors his father, a servant his master. If I then be your father, where's mine honor? And if I be a master, where's my fear? Saith the Lord unto you, O priest that despise my name. And you say, wherein have we despised you? You offer polluted bread upon my altar. What was the catalyst of them offering polluted bread upon the altar? Their attitudes of despising God's worship is what it was. They said that the table of the Lord is contemptible. So when my attitude is poor toward worship, then it's not going to be any surprise when my actions are poor as well.
You know, people may not realize that, but it's still the truth.
That's right.
If you have the right attitude, then you're not showing the proper respect to God. You may say, well, I love the Lord. Well, you don't love him.
No.
If you're not going to worship the way he wants to.
That's
and
right.
So that's an important, you cannot separate worshiping God in truth and spirit. They have to be together.
Got to be
You know,
together.
listen,
That's what
let
the
me
Lord said.
finish with Isaiah chapter 1, the latter part of verse 13. Incense is an abomination to me, the new moons, the Sabbath, and the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the sacred meeting.
That's it. That's it. So we appreciate you joining us on the Biblical Christianity Podcast. So much more to say about this, and we will be at the Lord's will. The third part of this series, we will focus in on the authority. So we didn't get to spend a lot of time talking about the authority of worship, but make sure that we understand this, that when it comes to worship, we have to do our worship according to the authority of God. It's not a free-for-all. We don't get to make it up. That'll be our next session on the Biblical Christianity Podcast. Thank you for joining us. Have any questions or comments? Our email address is at the bottom. Please get in touch with us. We'll see you next time.